Right, let's start. Welcome everybody to this Wednesday's E2W coffee break. It's fantastic to have you all here. Nice to see David again after a while. Hi, David. But today we have a really special guest for me. He's a good friend of my mother's, who you can just see her head on the screen there, and becoming a family friend as well. Martin Richards. Hi, give us a wave, Martin.
Thank you. Hello.
Right, so Martin is the retired, I think retired about 6 years ago, Martin, Chief Constable of Sussex. And a little later on, we can talk about policing and diversity within the police force itself, as well as diversity of policing. But I thought it's interesting, as always, as we regularly do on these calls, is to just go back in time a little bit, wind back in history, wind back pre-policing, pre-joining the police force, and find out a little bit more about Martin, the boy, the teenager, growing up. Martin, the son of a vicar, and the son of a headmistress, growing up in rural Warwickshire.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Tell us about your childhood, because that must have been fascinating, and perhaps the influence your parents had on you
Sure.
as a person.
Well, I mean, first of all, you've made me feel very old, Mark. Well, you haven't, but all the faces that are popping up on the screen as I look. Yeah, born in 1959, so I know you're not supposed to say ages, but that gives you a clue. But to pick up your theme, I will feel very lucky that I joined or was born into vicarage life. I've described it to you, I think, Mark, as a chocolate box sort of environment, possibly a bit naive in some respects and straightforward, but a very loving, a very poor family. But we always lived in fantastic houses because the Church of England give their vicars great properties, but no money to maintain them. So the beauty of growing up in a vicarage is, as a child on a tricycle, I could cycle from the front door to the back door inside the house, and it was 28 yards.
Wow.
But that's probably not that important for people tuning in today. More importantly, yes, a vicar's son. As importantly, a headmistress's son. My mother, also called Betty, like your mum, never learnt to drive, in spite of the fact that she was Gary Glitter's uncle, tried to teach her to drive, but failed miserably. But she did manage to hold down a proper job, more than a proper job, as a primary school headmistress. And I think she'd have described herself as a Victorian-style battle axe of a headmistress, with my father, the sort of genial, friendly, benign, but passionate vicar and clergyman. I was the middle one of three. I'm the middle one of three. My sister's a paediatrician in London, and my brother has worked in mental health as well as suffering from mental health, and he's a little bit older than me. But the vicarage life, I think, gave me a classless upbringing, if I probably had to pick one theme from it. It gave me a sense of public service, like it or not. It made me a Wolverhampton Wanderers supporter because my dad and my mum were both passionate fans. And probably made it almost inevitable that I would, in spite of trying to go into the city, I worked for what is now called KPMG, but in my time was Pete Marwick Mitchell, I think. I'm as old as that. So I went to Bristol University after Warwick School, did law, tried to get into accountancy, it just wasn't for me. And drifted maybe into the police when I saw an advert in the Observer newspaper for graduates joining the police, so age 22, but I fast forwarded.
Yeah, Martin, before we go to the police force, just wind back a little bit for me. So that many would see sort of idyllic, privileged, as you say, chocolate box upbringing. But you know, you had a working mother. You know, despite you know, being the headmistress of a primary school is a pretty, you know, is a responsible, you know, full-on job. Your father as a vicar, probably, you know, a different type of career and something I don't know much about. But seeing both your parents working and doing those corner of the community type roles, what did that instill in you in terms of your search for relationships later in life, in terms of what you were looking for, but also in sort of, that must have brought a level of desire to be a public servant as well?
Yeah, good question, and it's got many parts to the answer. I'll try and deal with them in turn. In relationships, it meant I was probably blessed as a child, but ill prepared for divorce and challenges that came later. I'll try not to go off on tangents, Mark. Yeah. I warned you I did that. So relationship-wise, it was beautiful to be a part of that as a child, but probably left me a bit exposed, as I would now say, through later life. In terms of working parents, our house was the office for a vicar, as it would be and is today. So when children of business dads, because they were all business dads in my upbringing, stayed with us for a day or 2 days, they couldn't believe the phone was always ringing, because their dad, and forgive me for that discrimination, but that's what it was, their dad's phone never rang at home, because it rang at work but not at home. Yeah. So I was in the office environment, so his work, my father's vicar's work, came to the house. My mum, to her credit, went off, even though she never drove, she went off at 7:30, different buses to get to different destinations for her work, and came back usually by 5 every day. And always, my dad was old school, she always, in spite of being a working headmistress, had a cooked meal on the table by 6:30. And for people who can't relate to that in any respect, just to remind, that was the 70s, I think.
Okay. All right. If you were ill, if you fell ill at school, who would come and collect you? Your mother or your father?
Well, my mother couldn't, because she was A, working, B, couldn't drive. I wasn't ill, but had I been, they'd have made arrangements. We lived a 15-mile drive with no public transport away from school. Yeah. And so we'd have just had to manage. But there was, I suppose, these, if it's not offensive to my 2 boys' generation, I don't think we were pampered. That's probably a very controversial word to choose, but we sort of just got on with things. And I guess it would have been, my dad would have come because he had that flexibility.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And presumably then, if you had, wind the clock forward to today, if you had been homeschooling, apart from your mother may have been at home, it would have been your father would have maybe been a more of an active carer to you and been around more than would have been traditional in those times.
I guess he would have been, but it just, frankly, Mark, it didn't happen that way.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Good. So, this rural chocolate box upbringing, off to university.
Yeah, off to university. Before that, worked in the catering trade in Bavaria, and learnt, I'm not sure I'm proud of this, but learnt to work really hard, that's okay, and drink and live life quite hard, because again, I guess that gave me a nice little break from, yes, I'd call it the chocolate box existence, but some probably smooth edges rather than rough edges. It was genteel. Yeah. And suddenly the Bavarian catering industry was anything but. So I probably had a bit of a rude awakening, having done French and German at school, wanted to improve my French, never got to France, so spoke German instead. And learned a lot about life in a short 6 months. So university, otherwise, I think, might have been quite a culture shock to be suddenly living away from home and all that goes with that. As it was, university was great for me. Loved moving to the city of Bristol, and did law with a view to not necessarily being a lawyer, but I had this naive, goes to the accountancy reference, thought I would go into business, not knowing at all what that meant. And it never happened for reasons I've touched on, tried Pete's after KPMG. After university, it didn't work for me. But university was fantastic. I also thought the move to London would be great. Rural upbringing, although Warwick was the school I went to, so it's a small town in the Midlands. Then to Bristol, which was the big city for me. And even then, in the late 70s, early 80s, the tradition was to move on to London. And I thought that would be a natural progression. But we lived in Northwest 10, myself with an old university friend in Kensal Green, if people know that. So it was an interesting angle on London, but it wasn't the one I'd seen on the films. And the work didn't work out for me. When it came to the police opportunity, I thought, do I try the Met? And I thought I was nervous enough about joining the police as a big step in life. To join the police in London was, for me, about 8 steps too many. And therefore, it was look towards home. In those days, and I think still today, there are 43 police forces in England and Wales. Warwickshire was the smallest, but next door is West Midlands with Birmingham, Coventry, Wolverhampton. And so I wondered, do I do the career thing, which I felt would be the West Midlands, second biggest force in the country, or do I do the familiar public service, people I may or may not know? You can guess I drifted to and joined Warwickshire, which I think some saw in career terms as a bit of a contradiction, joining on what even then was called the Accelerated Promotion Scheme, a fast track version which still exists today in its different guises, on the one hand, and on the other hand, joining the smallest force in the country. Some people thought it was a bit of an odd choice. Even more people thought joining the police was an odd choice, by the way. They thought, vicar's son, you must be soft, naive, and simple. And forgive me for people who know that's not true about vicar's children, but that was one of the stereotypes. And you're joining the police, which is full of bullies and aggressive men and horrible people. Another stereotype, again unfair in my view. People didn't see what I thought was a real sameness about vicarage life, primary school education, teaching, which is what my mum did, and serving the public as a police officer. But the lady in the village post office, the day my joining the police was announced to our small community, she'd seen me go off to KPMG, as it now is, with my briefcase and my pinstripe suits, looking all that I was meant to look like and slimmer than I am today. Then I announced, or it was said to the community of the village, that I was joining the police. And she took my mother aside and said very seriously, you must be very disappointed.
And how do you think your mother replied to that?
Knowing her, I think she would have been polite rather than rude, but would have been firm in her retort, which would have been, I'm very proud.
Yeah, good. And proper.
And that was then, that was 1982. Whether she'd have said she was proud after all the issues that faced me in the subsequent 32 years, I like to think she would have done, but at the time and throughout, she was proud and supportive, yeah.
Good. So there you are, you've joined the police, fast track scheme. Looking at it now, what from a diversity perspective, a new recruit now into the police force, how would they be different, and what would the maybe from your cohort of recruits?
My cohort of recruits, there were 60 and there were 2 women. That's joining at police constable rank, the lowest rank, which is where everybody joined then and more or less still do today. The attitudes were probably quite prehistoric, I would think, in some respects. If people have watched Life on Mars or Ashes to Ashes, the TV representations of a flashback in time in policing, they're meant to be set in the 70s, I believe. I recognise what's portrayed on TV as the 80s in the police that I joined. Horrible language to describe women that I wouldn't use on this call. Just awful. Bullying, it was great as well. So I don't want to kick off by giving a a very tricky picture. But absolutely, in those days, there were two reasons why a vicar would not send his daughter, using he deliberately there in the early 80s, into the police, is because it's too dangerous, they would have said, I think. And they would also have said it doesn't treat women very well. And I think they'd have probably been right on both counts. It's difficult, and having ended up as a senior manager, not to judge things now through senior management eyes. But when I then moved from the recruiting stage into my first police station, where you had 4 shifts to cover a 24-hour period, which in itself, family-friendly for policies did not exist as a phrase, let alone a concept. So the work came first without any consideration to what that meant for the worker. But we had 4 teams, and if of those, there were probably 80, 90 staff, there were 4 women, which was probably about right. They put 1 on each team because you needed women to search female prisoners, for example, and having a spread was as far as the thinking was taken in those days. Even in my earlier years, there was a view which said, actually, should we not buddy people up a bit and change that 1-1-1-1 sort of approach? But I think my main reflection would have been that horrible tendency to pick on a minority, whether it be the female in a male-dominated organisation, which policing was and the city was. But those things can be numbers-based and culturally based. But what isn't necessarily the case, but I felt it at the time, was a sense of pick on the minority. And who are the most, where is the power? And I don't want to get too heavy too early, really, but the bigger discrimination, actually, and obviously race and gender are two, the bigger one in policing, and whether it's true in the military and other organisations, I suspect it may be, was against civilian staff. So if you were a police officer, like if you were an RAF pilot, or if you were, and I did a spell in a local newspaper as part of a management program subsequently in my career, if you were a journalist as opposed to marketing, all sorts of attitudes sprung up. But trying to stick with your pace of this conversation, Mark, so sticking with my early days in police, family-friendly policies not considered, a man's world very definitely, and a white male's world very definitely, and a lot of emphasis on policing as it had, I think, rather naively grown up in the early days, that you needed to be male, you needed to be tall, there were height limitations and all sorts of other things. So issues around, can you empathise with people? Can you get alongside victims and witnesses to elicit the best statement and the best evidence, and all those sorts of skills and competencies, as I think we'd probably describe them these days. In the early 80s, there was an element of, are you a roughy tufty and will you be able to just hold the fort? I mean, I joined at the times of, many of your colleagues won't perhaps remember this, but Toxteth and Brixton and race riots and miners' strike and disputes. And if you just list those sorts of things, I don't think people automatically picture a police service that comes into your home at the time of great need and sits alongside you and provides empathy and support and guidance and collects evidence from you in a caring and thoughtful way. So it's a real hodgepodge.
Yeah. So the word force is it's probably wrong, isn't it, in many ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and yet having said that, there's a time when that's a requirement as well. And look at Washington recently, or anywhere you care to choose. And there is a time, that's the beauty of policing, actually, I think, where we call it command, or they, as I should now say, they call it command and control. And I'm not sure if that's a phrase or concept that works very often in the city, but there's a time for command and control, and there's a time for a slightly different, I think, more generic approach. If I may, Mark, there's only one story I came to this conversation wanting to tell, and it's about diversity. And it was a very big influence on me. Coincidentally, from another clergyman, Bishop of Bristol, years ago, sat next to me at a lunch at a time where it was very important, and again, I hope this isn't too dated, to say initially in our progression towards diversity and a more mature approach, it was really important to say, I am not racist. That was your gold star, if you like. And he told me how we've moved on from I am not racist to I'm anti-racism. Okay? And then, and this is 20 plus years ago, he said, but where we ought to be getting to is where we not only promote, but we celebrate diversity. And these days, that may all sound very cheesy and very obvious, but at the time, it was, I use the phrase deliberately, it's probably a bit crass, but it was very black and white. It was, I'm not racist, so I'm okay. And he was the first one to jump through all those phases for me and say, this is all about celebrating diversity. And I over the years, have reflected a lot on that, because when people say, when did you first see things changing in policing? It was probably at a CID, criminal investigation conference, just like you see on the TV, historically very male dominated, residential, heavy drinking culture, good times had by all, live hard, play hard. You've got the sort of picture, I suspect. And I was in those days in Avon and Somerset Police, with obviously Bristol as the main city and the rural areas all around. And at this national CID conference, when, and I'm not name dropping, but it happened that Cherie Blair was the guest speaker, which just helped really in the context that I'm describing. I was delighted to see 3 colleagues from my force, and catching myself out now, I have told the story in the past and said, and it really helps, they were all women. And what I'm not allowed to say to this audience, but I'll still say it in the confidence of this conversation, is I used to say, and they were all good looking. That isn't right and isn't helpful, but what they were was professional and polished in every respect, including appearance. And they arrived at the start of this conference and just so happened to arrive together, which I think was really good. And they walked across the conference hall to take their seats. And heads turned. And heads turned for any reason you might want to choose. I like to think they turned because they could see that this was a team of 3 who meant business and were part of a cultural shift. And as I say, I probably beat myself up by telling the story the way I used to about saying they were good looking, because that goes to all of the history that's gone before and plays to the frightening prejudices that can exist. But what they were and are, one of them went on to be Chief Constable of one of the 43 forces now, and one went on to be the senior police officer in Bristol. But what they were, and I think 1 or 2 still are top of their game, and it showed.
Martin, I think I'm just going to be a little supportive of you there, because I know, looking back at things I've done in the past and recounting them, and actually admitting them and being able to say, that was, I now recognise that is wrong. I believe is a really good way forward. It demonstrates actually that we are making progress, and we used to think like that, but now we think like this. And I'd say, well done for sharing that with us.
And a silly little example, just quickly on policing, is I'm fascinated by families and children in particular, and particularly in a mixed family and arrangements. And my wife, who's not in the room and not in the house at the moment, helpfully, because she might get upset about this, I'm always fascinated if there's a black mother or father and a white mother or father, there's a mix, what colour are the children? And she finds that a really awkward question to ask, and politically incorrect or insensitive or something. And she might be right in the in the microscope that many of us live our professional and increasingly personal lives under, I think. But for me, it's delightful to know and to be interested in how people are and what makes them tick and how they present and what they look like. Not with a view to, it comes back to the celebrating diversity, not with a view to pointing a finger, but just to say, oh, that's different, that's interesting, that's nice, you know. But it's interesting that even as I'm speaking to you now, feeling, not to your credit, fairly relaxed about it, it's interesting that some of us sometimes don't always find that easy conversations to have, and yet why not?
It'd be interesting to see what some of our audience think about that in
Sure.
advice they could give. Just finishing off on sort of diversity in the police force before we go on to diversity in policing. You know, you at the back end of your career, 6 years as Chief Constable of Sussex.
Yep.
What sort of things did you do to increase diversity and increase inclusivity within the force when you had that power and opportunity to do that?
Well, we were remorseless in our attempts to increase diversity on the basis of it. It's easy there are too many cliches really, but it made business sense, and I think increasingly people realise that one of the old cliches about policing is that you are there to be representative of the public that you serve, and quite clearly an all male or male dominated organisation is not going to be that, and quite clearly not taking recruits from across the board. You're not going to be that unless you do. 10 years away from the end of my service or thereabouts, we had the Stephen Lawrence Macpherson report and all that went with that, and really wrestled with, are we institutionally racist, yes or no, which was the label that Macpherson, for those who remember it, put upon the police. And I think with a degree of reluctance in some areas, because like many organisations, we were and are proud, we didn't really welcome that microscope and that rather sharp description. But by accepting it, which I think many of us did, it allowed us to break through, I'm not sure about glass ceilings, but it broke through innate, as the title suggests, an innate prejudice. So we were starting to look at what is it that we need when we recruit. And recruiting is, I think, as well as training and development and nurturing throughout, but recruiting is absolutely where you start to make the change, I think. And showing the rest of the organisation how and why you're recruiting and supporting the newbies, if you like, is really important. So I think that was critical. I think I could talk policies, but I don't think people want to hear about that. Yeah. I suspect you don't. The biggest mantra for me, which I reinforced at every level, and at a personal level, I saw every individual on promotion. So it's not just recruitment, but there are 8 grades in policing. And even though it's quite a big organisation of 5,000 staff, so promotions came along relatively frequently, I chose to make it a priority to spend half an hour or thereabouts, cup of tea, cup of coffee, chat in the office with every single individual who was promoted. So leadership, I guess, was one of the big ways to try and answer your question a little bit more thoughtfully on how, to personal level, we tried to make a difference so that you were living the philosophy all of the time and demonstrating it as much as you can. And the mantra, if there was one, which is not one I would claim, but I've stolen it with pride, is putting yourself in other people's shoes at all times. Where police, the beauty of policing, and it may apply to the disciplines that many of your colleagues are working in the midst of these days, but the beauty of policing is everything that you do, police would say operationally, you do strategically and in management terms as well, or you should do. So if you are with a rape victim on the front line, at the sharp end, putting yourself in their shoes starts to give you a better understanding of the evidence and the experience and the whole process. Process is a horrible word to describe a horrible event, but I hope you understand the point I'm trying to make. And that applies when I then became the equivalent of a chief exec, I suppose, and we had to take 25% costs out of the organisation, go from a budget of 250 million and 5,000 staff to 25% less of that across the board, when redundancies and compulsory redundancies were something that we weren't used to culturally. The putting yourself in other people's shoes applies in just that same way. And forgive me if that sounded a bit obvious. But for me, the selling point of the police, if I was trying to sell it, is the point I just made previously, I think. It doesn't matter if you're the police constable in somebody's house or at the roadside of a crash or whatever, or that you're trying to balance the books and give some visible leadership to a big organisation and work with partners in the 1.5 million residential community, business and residential of Sussex. You're still trying to put yourself in people's shoes, I think.
Yeah. Well, so just coming on, because I think that's a good way to sort of link on to diversity in policing, not the force itself. And we tend to, some of the things that you brought up there, the miners' strike, Toxteth, Brixton riots, and other things where we think about this force, but also, as Chief Constable of Kent, of Sussex, I keep saying Kent, Sussex. You've got the huge gay community in Brighton. You've got the diversity, of diversity of places like and cities, towns like Crawley. You've also then got a large, almost going back to your childhood, rural community, predominantly white and maybe haven't moved on in time, or maybe have. And then also the recognition that the force isn't just a force; it's there to represent the community that it is policing. Which means you've also got things, and you're having to handle things like you mentioned, rape victims, domestic violence, so crimes, typical crimes against women. How did that change over your time in the police force? How did
Well, I think, at the risk of repeating myself, probably knowing, well, first of all, profiling a community and an expectation is something. Moving from the arrogant to the humble, I suppose. I used to major on, as I suspect many of the organisations represented here today may have, posters on the wall or charts or vision statements or whatever else people are working on. I'm sure they're all very commendable and important, and we had much the same. And one of the words that I used to major on was humility, which is slightly old-fashioned, I think, to some ears. And in my attempts to define it, it was the nearest I could get to the opposite of arrogant. And I think to try and work away at arrogance works as an ambition culturally in just about every organisation I've had in dealings with. And since leaving the police, and you'll be pleased to know I won't go into all this in detail, but I would do a bit of work with mental health and the Diocese of Chichester and the Sussex County Cricket Club and a few other organisations. And my wife's been in teaching as well. Arrogance is the thing that possibly brings, is whatever the opposite of the golden thread is, that you really don't want to find in a city institution or in your children's school or in the local supermarket or at the roadside when you're being talked down to by your worst type of traffic cop, if you like. It's working away, digging away at that arrogant thread that I think probably is an answer to many of the cultural challenges that organisations, particularly service organisations, but I imagine profit-making organisations, and I suspect the two can overlap, have a similar challenge. And I think that's probably the area that is worth working at, and probably reflects as a commentary on your question and my policing experience. So Sussex, did we historically always look at the fact that communities in West Sussex, for those who know the county, quite different from the east, as you say, you've got Crawley with quite a high ethnic minority population, not a minority, in fact, in some areas of Crawley. But it's not just about race. Stick with Crawley. In today's climate, you've got all of the issues around Gatwick Airport and little or no work, which policing needs to understand. So suddenly, let's move away from, if you like, race or gender or anything else, and just look at employment and oiling the wheels of a living community in Crawley at the moment, which has a huge dependence and reliance on Gatwick, is something that every police officer who works in Crawley or should understand and needs to understand. So I think I've waffled a bit there, Mark, but I think it's working at that arrogance and understanding, coming back to my putting yourself in other people's shoes, understanding the environment.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because that old-fashioned policeman with, who was recruited because he was tall, strong, and that's how he got his authority. Is
you're right to say. You're right to say he, because that's how it was.
Yeah. It's very different from actually, the police person we see now, who, as you're saying, has become less arrogant, more understanding. Put myself in your shoes,
sure.
Rather than do what I say.
I hope so. I mean, she won't know me very well, but I have spent time and worked alongside Cressida Dick, the most senior police officer in the country, Commissioner of London, who is about 3'12", and is incredibly bright and incredibly all the things I've just said, in my view. But I do know that reputable, bright, interesting individuals I know of a certain generation and persuasion, and I would say this if Cressida was on the call, because she'll know this, because she's very wise and resilient. They take a look at somebody like Cressida and think, she's not very big, she's small, she doesn't make a secret of the fact that she's gay, and therefore to some people, even today, she can't be any good.
Yeah.
I mean, I happen to think she's outstandingly good, but that's even today. When I say to people that in 1982, when I joined the police, if you wanted to join the City of London Police, which still exists as a separate organisation, the square mile, in those days, you had to be 6 foot tall. So that was discriminatory, obviously, in every respect, but it showed what their priority was. So they were, and apologies to anybody with connections there, but they weren't necessarily saying, are we looking for people who are empathetic or mature or wise or intellectual or academic? They have to be 6 foot tall was qualification number one. And a silly little addition, but it's not as important, the first one. All their uniform, their buttons were gold, not silver, because the city had to be not real gold coloured, not silver coloured, because the city had to be different and better and more distinguished than everywhere else, which is just a flavour and a branding that I don't recognise today.
Martin, I'm going to draw this section to a close here. Thank you. That was really interesting and inspirational, and I think an insight into policing, which I'm sure many of us haven't had before. Certainly, I haven't and didn't know about. So first of all, thank you. At this point, I'm going to open up to questions. If you'd like to ask a question, you'll need to either come off mute, raise your hand, or wave at us, one or the other. Donna, are you were moving to ask a question? Come on, I'm going to encourage you to ask a question. You need to come off mute.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, lovely.
Hey, Donna, yeah. Yep.
Hi there, everybody. Yes, basically, I number one wanted to say thank you for that brilliant talk that you've given us. I've found it as a real insight. I'm actually in my final stage of my application for the police. So
Right.
of course, I'm looking very much into how the police works with diversity, because I do tick quite a few boxes in terms of diversity. I am mixed race, I am gay, and I am dyslexic. So it's all sort of a big hodgepodge of everything. So it's just sort of reassurance for myself as to how I could then fit in with the police force, because I very much like to work with the community and encourage diversity, because we know that the community is so diverse. So, sorry, my question is, basically, is there anything you could give us hints or tips as to how I can work best in the police force to ensure diversity ensues?
Well, first of all, I hope I've not put you off at all, because I wasn't intending it as a recruiting drive. I was just intending it to be an open account. I would encourage you to be exactly as you've just described and be yourself. And I hope this doesn't sound patronising. 10 years ago, first of all, we wouldn't have had COVID, we wouldn't have had Zoom, and we wouldn't have had these calls. But I would suggest to you that somebody with your profile would not have felt confident in telling anybody a number of the things that you've just shared with all of us. And I would also say, and that's so, if I may say, to your credit, your challenge, which is what you should bring to the police, is to say what you just said and to see how people respond. Okay. And to be confident. To be confident that there will be a warm reception and not an alienation, which is something that would have happened, I can say confidently, in the early 80s. If you feel at any point you have to hide rather than celebrate all that you've just described, then frankly, my private word would be the police is not for you because the police is awful, not because you are. But if it's that much of an uphill struggle, then the police have got it wrong, and you'd be better to take your skills and experiences this is a private view, this isn't a Chief Constable of today speaking, take your skills and talents somewhere else. But what my actual message would be is you won't need to, because you'll get one or two knockbacks, of course, but it doesn't happen everywhere. But I'm confident in saying whichever organisation, whichever force you're thinking of applying to, there will be a warm reception for 90% of the time.
That's fabulous. Thank you for that, Martin. Yeah, I think it's just a case that I think I could probably find a space for me there. I'm just ensuring that there is a space for me there.
Sure. Well, I suspect that people will be delighted to have you. And it's encouraging to everybody that police are recruiting at the moment, because I know that many organisations, for obvious reasons, through COVID aren't. So good luck.
Thank you very much. That's great. Thank you.
Donna, thanks for the question, and best of luck. Which force are you applying for, by the way?
Bedfordshire.
Bedfordshire. Okay,
right.
Brilliant. And whereabouts are you? Sorry, go on, Martin.
Two things about Bedfordshire. Sorry, Mark. Quickly, they used to have a female chief constable who I knew very well, Jill Parker. So again, I think that's relevant in terms of their understanding, and more pettily and ridiculously, for those with film knowledge, their previous chief constable was genuinely called Alfred Hitchcock, which some people of a certain age find unbelievable, but it's true.
Okay.
Donna, thank you. We got some more questions out there.
Nidhi, do you want to unmute yourself? I know you've written one.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, thank you,
Hi,
Martin.
how are you?
I'm great, Mark. This is fascinating talk, actually. And this ties back into, 2 weeks back, I went for sort of mentoring session where a data scientist actually raised this question that Met was actually inviting people to join them at a detective level, which was like sort of a straight route. And I was fascinated by that because this person comes from a technology background and probably want to leave the corporate setup and move into more sort of social nuance of providing their skills, which I thought Met was a fantastic place for this particular individual. So I thought I'll check with you, and that's why I dropped my question in the chat as well, that what is your view of joining Met? And I'm not sure if that is what Donna Clark took the step as well towards, but joining Met directly as a detective, which is like a direct route, which also has like more of a office role and rather a field role, because you do a lot of sieving through information, like sitting behind a screen. And are women more suitable in that role who come from a diverse background and do not have at certain point you sort of feel intimidated by being on the field. So I just wanted to pick on your brain from that perspective, if I may, please.
I mean, first of all, I'm 6-7 years out of date, but I can, as far as I know, confirm that direct entry, both at a higher rank, but also into a specialism such as detective work, is available even more now than ever it was. And that has to be a good thing. Picking up on what I think you were implying, which I think is very understandable, that there are skills and opportunities and job prospects in policing which are attractive to some, but the prospect of pounding the beat, as they used to say, of being out in all weathers, 24 hours a day, potentially, mixing with a level of aggression and violence and challenge is not for everybody, but it doesn't mean that policing isn't for them. So I think to give an opportunity to come in and avoid, frankly, some of those things that don't fall naturally into somebody's idea of a good day at work, I think is all to the good. And that is, I think, an approach that the senior leaders in today's police service recognise. There is an alternative view, which I hope isn't an old-fashioned view on my part, which says that there is a tremendous joy and opportunity and depth of experience if you can do the whole thing. And still, the majority still would, and do so with a confidence, as I was trying to say to Donna, a confidence of a supportive environment. If you feel it's something a challenge you can take on, then why not? Because that breadth and depth is fascinating. I had 2 little messages I used to say on sales pitch days, but I only said them because I believed them to be true. In my 32 years in policing, at every rank, every day went quickly, which sounds like a marketing slogan or something similar, but it is absolutely true. I never was looking at my watch to think, oh, if I can just spin this out till tea break, or I'll go out for lunch and then, at least I can go to Leon or somewhere and get something, and then I can make that last into the afternoon. Not so in policing. Every day goes quickly, or did for me. And the other one, which I hope again doesn't sound too cheesy, is that if you like soap operas, you'll like policing because you're in one. You are. And I don't just mean the bill, if that's not too old-fashioned for people, but I don't just mean a police detective show. Any soap opera, Emmerdale, EastEnders, Coronation Street, whatever.
The Archers.
Whatever, even the Archers, whatever lights your candle, to use a really old-fashioned phrase. In policing, you are in a soap opera, and that's just the staff issues. But if you actually then open it up to the public engagement that you get, and I mean, in terms of princes and paupers, you are dealing with all strands of society, often at their most vulnerable and weakest point. And it may sound a dreadful thing to say, but if you like people watching, more importantly, if you like serving people, that's even better. But if you like people watching, it's a fascinating work.
Excellent. Thank you, Martin. And all the best, Donna. I'm sure you'll get in through.
Mark, I've got a question.
David.
Hi, Martin. Thank you again. Great, great listening to you. I just wondered, but when you become Chief Constable, did you feel that you were a policeman that had become a CEO, or a CEO that used to be a policeman? If that's not too much of a smart ass sort of question, if you know what I mean.
I think it's a really important question. It goes to everybody from pre-Margaret Thatcher, but she was one of those who thought direct entry into CEO level, Chief Constable level, was something to work towards. So the question is on the money, David, and always has been, really. I felt I was a CEO, definitely. You know, when I talk to police groups, but let alone when I'm desperately trying to get a new job or impress people beyond policing, I will start by saying, and I think I've said it today, 5,000 staff, 1.5 million customers, £250 million budget. In a way, I'm deliberately, maybe too simplistically, trying to show that I wasn't necessarily a police officer by starting the description of my working day with that sort of data. But I do think that understanding, I mean, I alluded to the football and the Wolverhampton Wanderers right at the start. My other big passion, apart from family, is sweets and chocolates. And my dream job would be chief exec of Cadbury or Mars or somebody like that. I think knowing about chocolate is really important, in my personal view, for the CEO of the chocolatiers of this world. And I think I'm fudging your answer, really, your question, David. It's called Chief Constable. Deliberately, I think you're still a police officer, and I still feel that there's a huge risk about thinking when you've got 32 years service that you know what it's like to be a 22-year-old policing the nightlife environment of any town or city across the country. I mean, I'm as out of touch as I'm probably presenting, David, in trying to understand that community and that world. So there is obviously that inherent risk that you think you know what it was like because you did it yourself a long, long time ago. But I do feel that there is something that is so physical about and so emotional about, in terms of emotional intelligence or emotional feelings generally, about the policing role at the sharp end, that when you're reorganizing people's working lives organizationally, strategically, it really helps if you've got, in my view, if you've got just a taste of what it's like. And I've flipped and flopped throughout my senior experiences in policing over that very question. You know, if you're a CEO of a chocolate company, could you be CEO of what used to be called the National Coal Board, to go back to miners' strike? Could you be CEO of a car company or whatever? And I'm still a bit mixed on that. And in my heart, I think you want to love the subject matter and understand the subject matter at grassroots level, not just around the boardroom table.
I think it's an interesting one because I think it depends hugely on the area. I think part of policing, I don't know whether it's a vocation, that's probably a bit too strong, but I think there are easier ways to make money than be a copper. And I think it's probably the same with things like ambulance drivers, particularly the way they get treated now.
Sure.
But I think maybe the reason it's different is because it's different. I think you can move between industries or sections of an industry in financial services, despite what people say. It's not that difficult. But I think in other areas, yeah, I wonder. I mean, clearly I have no experience, but I do wonder whether we'll ever get to the stage whether there's a shadow arrangement where there'll be a manager element or a CEO that's very commercially minded for a chief constable and another figurehead. I don't know. It doesn't strike me as something somebody could do unless they'd really had some sort of experience of policing, regardless of whether they were fast tracked or not. I think the idea of the Unilever senior manager coming into Sussex and going, right, you know, let's change the way you operate. Good luck if anybody's brave enough to do that.
Yeah, and to give you a picture of, say, I walked away or retired from Sussex Police 6-7 years ago. Our top team was, I think, 7 people, and that included an HR director, female, a finance director, male, a corporate development director, female, a communications director, female, and it was more than 7, it was 8, and then 3 senior police officers, one of whom happened to be female. So picking up your point, I'd hate to give people the impression that was then. You know, we've moved on 6-7 years since then, but we had a top senior team at CEO level around the table, 8 of us, with some diversity of professional skills and competencies. And the finance director had come in from the private sector. The HR director had worked for Halifax, I think, and is now working for the University of South Wales. So you'd got, as it happened, the comms director was Home Office and police background, but she was extraordinarily good. So you've got a mix still, even though not everybody had got, if you like, police officer written right through them. My wife's worked for, in the long time past, for a colleague in the world of primary education who famously said they didn't like children very much. And I just think when you get to that sort of stage, you're in the wrong work, you're in the wrong job. And I think with policing, if you don't like and have a drive and enthusiasm for the challenge of policing, then I think being the CEO is not for you, would be my personal view.
Martin, I'm I'm conscious of the time, and we've just, our hour is up, and I know some people are needing to get back to work and on with other parts of their lives. So I'm going to draw this to a close now and just say thank you. I think most of all, thank you for your honesty as well, and for opening up and sharing in the way that you did. It was absolutely brilliant. Thank you. I hope we can perhaps have you back at some time in the future. Thanks for the hands up, the claps, the thumbs up. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much, Martin. Just coming on quickly before you will go to some domestic things. Next week, we've got a fantastic lady, Eilish Jameson, joining us, talking about her career pivots from financial services to a portfolio career to an entrepreneur. She's highly inspiring. Come and join us for that. Love to see you all again next week. And another point, in a few weeks' time, beginning of March the 8th, I think, day before my birthday, note everybody, is International Women's Day. And Katie and the team at E2W want to put together a small video for that, celebrating that from an E2W perspective. And what we're looking for is people just to do 10-second sound bites around various topics to do with International Women's Day. So if you'd like to volunteer for that, please reach out to Katie or myself, and we can get you involved. Katie, thank you very much for organising, putting on, doing everything that you do so brilliantly. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Martin. Lovely to see you. Again, I'll be hanging around as I normally do at the end of this to have a chat with anybody that wants a catch up and a chat and thoughts. Otherwise, see you all next week. Thank you.
Thank you.